Now, before we go much further, I'm going to take a moment and talk about biodiversity and taxonomy. These concepts help us communicate what we have learned in science to other people and allow us to cross language barriers. So this is the reason that we make you memorize the names of different things, or that we use Latin and Greek and all that stuff in order to communicate. It helps us make a worldwide communication rather than just communicating with those really local scientists. Let's start with the taxonomy. The word taxonomy literally means arrangement law. It is a branch of science that is concerned with the classification of organisms. Okay, so it's concerned with classification in general. So this is where, if you're super interested in putting things in little boxes and you want to know how they have how they relate to each other, this is what you go into. You become a taxonomist. So it takes a very special person to be a taxonomist. You have to be very, very detail oriented, and you really want to organize things. And let me tell you, organizing nature is hard. We're going to talk about a bunch of adaptations and a whole bunch of these concepts behind why nature is the way it is. But through all of that, it is very difficult to classify things in nice and neat ways, the way that humans like it. So, taxonomy. Each living thing has a scientific name. That name consists of two parts. Okay, so the generic name and the specific name, the genus and the species. So for example, let's look at this gorgeous lion right here. The genus, the generic, and the species, the specific name, is Panthera leo. This is the lion. So the Panthera is the name of the genus to which the animal belongs, and Leo is the name of the species within this genus. So the system used for naming organisms like this, we call the binomial system, the two-name system. It was devised by a Swedish biologist many, many years ago, known as Carl Linnaeus. So if you look up Linnaeus, look how fancy he is. He is a really famous scientist and physician because of this binomial system. Now, where there are subspecies or even smaller groups recognized, don't worry, I'll go into subspecies in a minute, we see a trinomial name. So for example, Panther leo, that's the genus and species, but there is a subspecies of lion which looks a lot like your generic lion that occurs only in India. So in this case, we add on a subspecies, Panthera leo persica. So this occurs only in India, and it's the locally used name so that the scientists looking at this particular animal know exactly what we're talking about. So it's the locally used name, so the place of a particular species varies from place to place, from language to language, may vary over time. So we use these scientific names to stop confusion. So what I mean when I say locally used names, these are the common names. So we don't often use common names in science. This is because they're inconsistent. The vernacular names are not widely used by scientists unless the species concerned is also identified by the scientific name itself. So vernacular names, those are the things that people call just random things like a lion, right? You see this, it's a lion. But the problem is this isn't telling me anything about taxonomic relationships. It may not tell me where it lives. It may not tell me any closely related species. And you are going to be calling anything that has this sort of general look a lion, right? There's a whole bunch of different lions out there. So that muddies the waters, really. Unrelated species may have similar vernacular names. So as we start getting to know some of the major players in carrion ecology, I'm going to be giving you their scientific names and only sometimes their common names. That is because of this issue with common names and the confusion it causes. Let me just give you a quick example. So this fly right here, I'm sure you've seen these before. This is Topola laterus. It is a common fly around the world, and it has a myriad of common names. Now, I know them personally. I grew up calling them crane flies. That's what a lot of people have called them. However, I grew up in California. People called them crane flies. When I moved here to Texas, people started calling them mosquito eaters or mosquito hawks because they kind of look like mosquitoes. And the idea was, hey, you are what you eat. They must eat mosquitoes. They don't. They're actually nectar feeders. As adults, they don't even have mouth parts in some of the species. So, they don't eat mosquitoes. They just look like really big mosquitoes. Some people in the region will also call them gallinippers or golliwoppers. What the hell is that name? That's something I'd never heard before. Recently, I actually had a very confusing conversation with somebody. Somebody came up to me and called them daddy longlegs. Now, that's the common name that I know for a type of arachnid. Okay? But this person was insisting that this daddy longlegs flies. Now, as an entomologist, that was super confusing. So this guy comes up to me and goes, hey, what do you know about daddy longlegs? I know some. I'm an entomologist. I know a little bit about arachnids, but not as much as about insects. And he goes, yeah, well, we have these flying daddy longlegs. And immediately in my head, spiders or their close relatives don't have wings. They don't fly. What are you talking about? So it took me a while, as this person was insisting that their daddy longlegs flies, that they were actually talking about what I know as crane flies, or what other people know as mosquito eaters. So their personal common name for just their little tiny town that they were from was daddy longlegs. I'd never heard that before. So these common names change with region. They change from place to place, and they'll even change from generation to generation. So you end up with this confusion. It took me a while to figure out what this guy was talking about. Eventually we got down to it. It would have fixed everything if he had come up to me and said, hey, I've got this Topola laterus. Everybody knows exactly what that is. In fact, I'd been able to tell him, oh yes, that species, it has mouth parts. This is what it feeds on as adults. This is how long it lives. This is where the larvae feed. If it told me a different species, it would say, oh, that species doesn't have mouth parts. So you know a lot about it. So it's its scientific name. So the scientific name fixes that barrier to communication. It fixes that confusion. And it goes so far as to cross language barriers. So no matter what region you're from, no matter what language you speak, the scientific name remains the same. So here I've given you an abstract. This is a paper that is written in Russian, and it is about flies. Now, I don't speak Russian. I don't read Russian. I've never taken anything that allows me to do so. However, I know it's about flies because of the scientific names. So, Diptera, that is a universal name for fly. That's the order. Callifornidae, that is the family. So I can look at this, no idea what it's saying, no idea what it's saying. Diptera callifornidae. Okay, I know it's talking about flies. Now, looking through the abstract, I can find the scientific genera and species. So here, it's Polinopsis mongolica, Polinopsis suzii, Califera, subalpina, etc., etc. Cyanoima cadaverina, that's actually one I know really well. So I can go through this and I have no idea what they're talking about, but I know the species they're talking about. Cool. So see how useful that is? So I can collaborate with people across the world, and while I may not be able to understand most of the words they're saying, if I say Cyanoima cadaverina, they know that I'm talking about a particular species of Callifornidae. And that is really great. So the names are consistent across the board. Now, the way we get down to this binomial or the trinomial scientific name is we have to subscribe to a full classification system. This classification system allows us to classify all organisms in a hierarchical manner. This is that naming system that you had to learn throughout all your biology classes, right? Where you go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And if you were like me going through school, your teachers always had that way of remembering these things. I grew up in Fullerton, California, so mine was keep police cars off Fullerton's great streets. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Different word for the first letter of each name. Okay, so you remembered all these things. So basically what this is this is a system of smaller and smaller groups, each a subset of the one above it, and we use this to put organisms into little smaller and smaller boxes so we can understand them. We as scientists really like putting things in boxes. We like them organized and orderly. We do this so that we can classify everything or group everything together, and we base this on physical, unchanging characteristics. Of course, there's a problem with the system. Nature doesn't work this way. It's not nice and neat. It doesn't like to fall into these arbitrary categories that we put it in. Instead, we keep finding new groups and new types of life and things that we don't even know. Are they alive or not? I mean, think about a virus. We won't really have time to go into it this semester. But there are still massive arguments about is a virus alive or not? What is going on there? So there's all this stuff going on. So we keep finding new groups, new types of life that don't neatly fall into these previously formed categories. Because of this, we've had to amend and rearrange our classification systems over time. If you're old like me, you might remember one of the earliest ways that we classify things. This is the three kingdom system. In this case, we start out with the largest groups, the kingdom, and all of life that we knew about fell into one of three kingdoms: the animals, the plants, or single-celled organisms. We called them Animalia for the animals, Plantae for the plants, or the Protista for the single-celled organisms. So I remember way back in grade school, you know, is it an animal? Is it a plant? Is it a protist? Or is it something tiny? Okay, so this is the most simplistic system that you might still see taught today. Usually we see it taught to really, really young students, people who are, just getting started in school, just barely learning to read. So little kids who are trying to categorize the world, so we try to make it as simple for them as possible. The problem with this system is that it was made in the late 1800s, and this was before we really understood the full extent of what life is out there. Microscopes were just becoming a thing. Things are going on like that. And it just doesn't cover the sheer complexity of the world. So in 1938, the three kingdom system was replaced with the four kingdom system. So this four kingdom system, animals and plants were still around, but the Protista, the name was changed a little bit. It was changed into Protechista. That's what we're going to say today. And they added on the Monera. So the Protechista, these are simple eukaryotic organisms. So remember eukaryota, those are organisms with membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus, while the Monera is a kingdom of prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are those single-celled organisms with no membrane-bound organelles and no nuclei. So these include the bacteria. So right around this 1938, people said, okay, bacteria and these other single-celled organisms, they don't fall into the protists, so let's make an entirely new kingdom. So you can see how the system is a little bit better, right? Figured out the bacteria exist, made an entire kingdom for them. But then things got more complex as we started to get more knowledge about the world. In 1969, scientists decided that a five-kingdom system would be even better. So we've got our Animalia, we've got our Plantae, we've got our Protists, we went back to Protista, we got a Monera, and then they added on the fungi. So fungi got their own kingdom because they have a particular structure in their cell walls that is unique. When we find these types of physical, unchanging characteristics, it's really hard to argue that this group of organism falls into another kingdom. So we make a new one. So that's what happened in 1969. They said, okay, fungi have these cell walls. They've got this stuff in the cell walls that no other organism has. That belongs in its own kingdom. And the five kingdom system is actually the most commonly taught throughout schools right now. It's complex enough to allow for a good working classification system, but not so complex that students new to science have to cry about all the ridiculous names they have to remember. You'll find that we really use a classification system that works for our system or works for our area of study. In the 1990s, scientists decided there need to be even larger groups to explain how all these kingdoms related to each other. So there was a time between 1969 and 1990 where more and more kingdoms were being added on. It got really, really complex. So they stood up and said, okay, we need even larger systems. You might hear of the word domain. So this is where we entered the word domain. You might hear of domains being called empires or super kingdoms. People like making up new words in biology. That's just what we do. So the word domain is the one that seems to have stuck, but the domains classify life into groups based on the presence or absence of cell membranes and nuclei. So the three domain system, we have the domain archaea, the domain bacteria, and the domain eukaryota. The archaea are prokaryotic cells, so cells without membrane-bound organelles, but they do have lipids in their actual cell membrane that are branched hydrocarbon chains attached to glycerol. What this does is it allows these organisms to withstand extreme environments, such as high temperatures or highly acidic conditions. So these are the extremophiles, and they have structures to support this system. This is a group of really, really ancient organisms. They had to deal with some really extreme environments back in the day, and they're still around today. The bacteria are also prokaryotic cells, so no membrane-bound organelles, but unlike the archaea, their membrane lipids are made of unbranched fatty acids. So it's branched fatty acids in the archaea, unbranched in the bacteria. So they have significantly different characteristics. That's what got them their own domain. And then finally the eukarya. These are all the eukaryotes, those organisms that contain membrane-bound organelles, including a nucleus. So we've got these three major domains. And then each one of these domains in this system broken up by a bunch of different kingdoms, and it goes all the way down from there. In 2015, however, the latest revision of this system came out. A really big paper came out reorganizing things once again. This time, they reorganized it into 2 super kingdoms or domains and 7 major kingdoms. Now, this paper was amazing. I've actually put it up for you if you're interested under the articles for this module. The authors worked to take information from the 1.6 million identified species out there and knowledge from over 3,000 taxonomists and all their papers and all their books and all their work over hundreds of years, and trying to catalog all known life once and for all. So this is a massive paper. It was a massive undertaking. And really, this paper became a representation of what we know now. And it makes a special point of acknowledging what we know as well as what we don't know. That is new for a lot of this organizational system. It's actually saying, you know what, there's a lot that we don't know, and here are areas of weakness, and here are areas that we need to go into. And it's trying to create a consensus, really, for this organization system. This allows us to use this system as a working system. It gives us the freedom to move things around. It gives us the freedom to add stuff and take stuff away, be splitters or lumpers or whatever we need within a system. So this is what this newest system looks like. In this case, the super kingdoms are kind of like the domains. They're above the kingdoms and they encompass a lot of things. So the 2 super kingdoms in this paper are the prokaryota, the prokaryotes, and the eukaryota. So it goes back to that more simplistic things. Either you have membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus, or you don't. Just yes or no. We haven't yet found anything that doesn't fall into one of those, so great. So those 2 things. Now, the 2 super kingdoms are then broken up into 7 kingdoms total. So it's a 2 domain or 2 super kingdom and 7 kingdom system. The prokarya have bacteria, protozoa, and archaea. Those same characteristics that we saw before. So the archaea, the bacteria, the protozoa, they have those different membranes. They can withstand different things. They're more ancient, that sort of thing. So we've seen these before. Okay, that's those 3 kingdoms that fall into the prokaryota. Then the eukaryotes have the animalia, the animals, has the plantae, the plants, the fungi, and a new kingdom specifically for this. These are the chromista. The chromista are algae whose chloroplast contains chlorophylls A and C, basically those chlorophylls that absorb blue, green, and red light. So they are slightly different from the plants and slightly different from the fungi. So they have their own kingdom. So we've got this 2 domain or 2 super kingdoms, 7 kingdom system. From there, the kingdoms are broken up further and further down to the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, this is the classification system we're going to use for the purposes of this class. I personally really like this system simply because it's usable. It allows us to understand relationships between things. It takes into account all manner of new species that we found over the last few hundred years, and it gives us tools to classify whatever organisms we're going to run into. If you read that paper, though, you're going to find areas where we just don't know information. There's just stuff we don't know about. And there are areas where people are still debating the efficacy. I mean, this is the beauty of science. That's why I love this science in particular. It's a work in progress. It's going to continually change from year to year as more taxonomists start trying to tackle these really big questions. So, this is our basic naming system, right? The one that we learned way back in whenever you first started learning science. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This, though, is really what it looks like. So the system that you're going to see me talking about throughout this semester is much more complex. So we start out with our super kingdom or a domain. And according to the paper, there's 2 domains, okay? Then we break that up into 7 kingdoms. Then we can break up kingdoms into something slightly smaller. The sub-kingdom, which is a little bit smaller than the kingdom, and then the infra-kingdom, which is a little bit smaller than the sub-kingdom. That we can break up into the superphylum, and then ultimately the phylum. So it goes kingdom, sub-kingdom, infra-kingdom, superphylum, bigger than the phylum, subphylum, and infraphylum. Then we go into the class. We start with the slightly bigger, the superclass, then the class, subclass, infraclass, superorder, order, suborder, infraorder, superfamily, family, subfamily, infrafamily, supergenus, genus, subgenus, infragenus, superspecies, subspecies, and then infraspecies. So you can see we still got the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, but now we are able to break those things up into slightly larger or slightly smaller groups. So when you see super, that means slightly above whatever the root word is. So superphylum, slightly bigger than the phylum. Sub means just below. Infra means just below sub. So you are going to hear me talk about this. Now, not every species or every organism that we're going to talk about has every tiny little taxonomy. We don't have or haven't classified every single thing with a superphylum, a phylum, a subphylum, an infraphylum. It just isn't necessary. These are tools. They are not required. We use them when we need to really communicate the relationships between different organisms. It just depends on how much we know about the species and what we need to communicate, what we need to do in order to work with them effectively. So this is how I'm going to be classifying organisms during this course. So when you hear me say something like infraorder or subspecies, you know what I'm talking about. All right, that's enough new words for now. Let me know if you have any questions about these ridiculously complex subjects. Talk to you soon.